Socrates once stated that we should follow the argument wherever it leads. When we look at the most profound question of life, does God exist? We should certainly follow his advice. When we do, we'll find evidences that show us God is real. Let's look at 6 proofs that show God exists.
Why, hello my fellow apes. I'm Stephen Woodford, and as Kyle Butt of World Video Bible School just stated, we are today digesting 6 proofs of God's existence. Now you might be thinking, what God? Vishnu, Odin, Osiris? I mean, different people in different parts of the world and at different times believed in all sorts of gods, and that's a great question that you'll find comfortably swept under Kyle's carpet. Hence, we'll have to proceed with a very vague notion of God. Shall we?
Number 1, the universe must have a cause. The most fundamental law of science is the law of cause and effect. And it says that for every material effect we see, there is a cause that came before it or was simultaneous to it, and that is greater than it.
I don't know about you, but when I first heard of this law of cause and effect, I had a case of the Rock's eyebrow. And when Kyle stated what the law is, I smelt what can only be described as divine excrement. If you copy-paste Kyle's so-called most fundamental law of science,
the most fundamental law of science,
into Google, you'll find 8 results, 4 of which are mirrors of Kyle's script, 3 are theists quoting Kyle's video, and 1 is to an inaccessible site. Simply put, Kyle conjured it out of nothing, just as he claims his God conjured the universe out of nothing. What's more, notice that the definition that Kyle gives us is of classical causation plus some suspiciously convenient words.
And that is greater than it.
No, Kyle. Even in classical physics, a mere pebble can cause a colossal avalanche. And funny enough, effects are overwhelmingly the result of a congregation of causes, not one. Oh, and don't think that you're adding the word material slipped us by. I'd say good try, but it wasn't.
The universe is a material effect. So what caused the universe?
Now, that's a bold claim, I hear you all say. What evidence does Kyle offer to support his assertion that the entire universe is an effect, let alone that it's exclusively a material effect? Well, he misrepresents the Big Bang, which we'll get to in just a moment. First, I want to emphasize that by defining the universe as an effect, Kyle is assuming his conclusion of the universe having a cause. He's begging the question. He's trying to prove that the universe has a cause, all while assuming that the universe is an effect.
That's what is popular today, that there was some type of singularity that exploded in something called the Big Bang. But then when you try to get down to the bottom of what's a singularity, well, what we hear from the scientific community that suggests to us, the cosmologists, they say, well, a singularity was something that popped into existence from nothing.
Except they don't though, do they, Kyle? You're making things up again, aren't you, Kyle? As the theoretical physicist Sean Carroll puts it,
we use the phrase the Big Bang to refer to that earliest moment of the history of the universe where we don't understand what is going on. It's a placeholder for our lack of understanding.
Thus, we don't get to call the grand cosmos an effect, since we simply don't know what happened before the Big Bang.
Proof number 2. Design demands a designer. It is a truism that everybody recognizes that this universe looks designed. In fact, when we see the various different aspects of nature and we see birds and squirrels and trees
and parasites and cancer and birth defects and billions of uninhabitable planets in a vast universe that's overwhelmingly deadly to all known living organisms. Yeah, it never ceases to irritate me that proponents of teleological arguments ignore the abhorrent designs of life for they contradict an omnibenevolent, omnipotent God. Look at the trees, they say, not the zombie fungus upon its branches that's been lovingly designed to infest living creatures to split their body open.
Where does design originate? Well, what you and I both know is that when you see things that function and they're complex, that design comes from an intelligent designer. Big explosions just simply don't bring about order. They don't cause things that are functional and complex to come into existence.
But putting aside the abhorrent designs, notice that this is William Paley's watchmaker analogy. It's the whole a painting requires a painter, a building requires a builder, and therefore a human requires a human maker. It's the claim that complexity requires a creator. Now, I've said this before and I'll say this again. If I lived before Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species, there's a very high chance that I would be a deist, explicitly due to how convincing teleological arguments were before the publication of this masterpiece. There's a reason why the paradigm shift of Darwin is recognised as one of, if not the most important in history. Evolution by natural selection explains exactly how unconscious natural forces can and have produced exceeding complexity. Furthermore, it perfectly explains the vile as well as the beauty, and the near-perfect as well as the catastrophic failures. God, on the other hand, is and will always be an argument from ignorance. We don't know, therefore God. The trees are beautiful, therefore God. The glomerata wasp reproduces by forcibly injecting its larvae into caterpillars, therefore, let's just get to the next proof.
Proof number 3. Life demands a supernatural life giver. You see, in the material world, we have come to understand that there is a law of biology called the law of biogenesis. Law of biogenesis simply says this, that in this material, natural world, life comes from previously existing life of its own kind.
Shall we? Shall we Google Carl's definition? Yeah, 2 results, one of which being a mirror by a Presbyterian church and the other being a quote of Carl's video.
Now, when we look at how people used to think about life, they said, no, life can arise spontaneously from non-living chemicals. And yet every single biological experiment has shown us that that simply is biologically impossible. Life doesn't arise from non-living chemicals.
Back in the day, Aristotle and his motley crew inferred that since complex organisms emerge from such things as soil and rotten carcasses, it follows that complex organisms can spontaneously arise from non-living substance. But in the 19th century, Louis Pasteur and John Tyndall disproved this long-established belief by demonstrating that complex organisms are the product of reproduction. Rotten meat doesn't produce flies, the fly larva within the rotten meat produces flies. Creationists such as Carl like to act as if this disproved the hypothesis of abiogenesis, which is the natural process by which single-celled organisms, as opposed to complex organisms, emerge from non-living matter. But it doesn't.
Where did life originate if it doesn't arise from non-living chemicals? You see, the idea that there's no God suggests to us that there had to be some singularity without a cause that exploded, and that explosion brought about design, which we've never, ever seen happen. And then ultimately, somewhere the non-living chemicals gave rise to life, but that's biologically impossible.
Again, spontaneous generation has been disproved, but abiogenesis most certainly hasn't. To say that it is impossible that single-celled organisms emerge from non-organic matter is to display one's complete ignorance of science and epistemology.
Proof number 4. Moral law demands a moral law giver. If some things are objectively morally right, and other things are objectively morally wrong, then there must be a God.
I recently created a response to Carl Butt's colleague Eric Lyons, who expressed this same sentiment. And just as Eric defines moral laws as divine edicts, so too does Kyle.
You see, if we evolved from primordial slime over multiplied millions of years, at what point did objective moral values arise? We don't look at a dog and say that that dog objectively, morally violated some rule when he steals a bone from another dog. We don't say, hey, he violated a objective moral value. We just don't say that.
While objective moral frameworks exist, the type of objective moral framework that Carl insists upon, divine command theory, doesn't. If divine moral laws did exist, then, by virtue of them being divine, it would follow that a God exists. But again, they don't. Even among those that claim that they do, their so-called objective morality has historically demonstrated itself to be every bit as whimsical and subjective as any other moral framework. At one point, divorce was objectively condemned. Now not so much. Unbaptized babies went into limbo, now they're in heaven, and women were once objectively less than men, but now they're just different.
Proof number 5, free will exists. The atheistic idea that there is no God is founded on the idea of materialism, the idea that this material world is all that there is, all that there was, and all that there ever will be. Because of that, atheism has to suggest that you as a person don't really have free will.
Jesus Christ, what a load of gish gallop. First, Carl fails to define what type of free will he's referring to. Is it libertarianism or compatibilism? Because compatibilism is compatible with materialism, whereas libertarianism is not. Second, atheism is not the idea that there is no God. Indeed, it's not an idea at all. It's a lack of being convinced of the idea that at least one God exists. And third, atheism is not founded on materialism. There are plenty of atheists that believe in all sorts of supernatural, non-materialistic things, from astrology to ghosts to telekinesis to libertarian free will and beyond. This is just an unfortunate common straw man from Carl.
And proof number 6, human reasoning. You see, we reason on a regular basis. We understand abstract ideas. If we were products of blind, chance, random processes over multiplied millions of years, reasoning and the laws of reasoning simply would have no explanation.
But that's the thing about natural selection, isn't it? It's not blind chance and random. Genetic mutations are random, but the process by which they survive, natural selection, is determined. Being able to understand the dangers that envelop us, and consequently make decisions based on that understanding, gives us a very obvious advantage that the unconscious process of natural selection would promote. If two ancient humans saw a herd of charging mammoths, and one had the inclination to consider stepping out of their path, then she would have a higher chance of surviving to pass on her genes of having reasoning capacity.
And yet we reason together on a regular basis. From where does reason arise? It's got no naturalistic, atheistic explanation.
It doesn't have an atheistic explanation, agreed, just as it doesn't have a non-stamp collecting explanation. But contrary to Carl's assertion, there is a naturalistic explanation, natural selection, that not only accounts for our successful reasoning capacities, but also our failures, such as has been embodied by Carl here. Anyhow, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means. I really appreciate your support, especially during these hard times. Thank you.